Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We will learn about the lies, the deception, the deceit, the fabrication of history in this presentation. And this is all concerning a recent podcast between Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, and Jordan B. Peterson, the clinical psychologist based in Toronto. It came, of course, as a shock for so many of us, kind of a sense of outrage from many communities about how an individual like Peterson could host and stage this event with Netanyahu, not so much because it was an interview, but because that interview was full of such fabrications of history that it was just flabbergasting. The amount of lies told in that space of time, one after the other, was horrifying. But not because they were told by a mass-murdering, xenophobic Zionist like Netanyahu, but because they were not pushed back against, but because the one who was interviewing him, in this case Jordan Peterson, was not interrogating him about those lies, was not questioning him about those lies. That was really the tragedy in the whole thing. This is why this is addressed to Jordan B. Peterson. For a man, of course, who has championed many good causes, spoken about issues of justice, about morality, was not somebody who could in fact abide by the principles of moral consistency in this issue. Someone who could be morally consistent in his issues of social justice and justice at large. Remember, we're not talking about anybody or any event or any history for that matter. We're talking about a long-standing issue of many types of zulm, of injustice have taken place against the Palestinian people. And we're talking about a person, Netanyahu, who is a mass murderer, a person whose state is founded on principles of apartheid, and which exist until today. Apartheid, xenophobia, racism, dehumanization of Palestinians, settlement, occupation of land, killing, murder, theft, all of these things combined and much worse. This is why this is not a small issue. This, in fact, is a very big issue. And the hope is, therefore, that we can learn as human beings that if we have moral compassion in one thing, we could learn to have moral consistency in other things as well. Now, you said, Mr. Peterson, towards the beginning of your presentation that you've heard mostly from young Palestinians about their grievances, and now you kind of intend to set the record straight, so to speak, by questioning Mr. Netanyahu, who might kind of fill in the gaps of that narrative. I was quite perplexed, in fact, about why would you feel the need to mention you've heard from mostly young Palestinians? It almost gives the assumption that there are no older Palestinians who share that same narrative of suffering. And secondly, as a visual, I kind of got the impression by saying that it's almost as if you're juxtaposing between the narrative of young Palestinians who might not know that much because they're very young, and here we have the two elders in the room, Netanyahu and you. And of course, you're going to set the record straight for the rest of the world because you're more civilized and you're older. My worry, Dr. Peterson, is that you have been affected by the long history of stereotyping, of labeling, of not identifying the Arabs as fully human. And I say that if you read the works of Jack Sheehan, the book called Real Bad Arabs, you'll get my point, because he lists, for example, numerous examples of the way that Arabs have been shown on media, news items, in movies, in cartoons, in drama shows, and the Arab is usually the villain, the seductress or seductor, the terrorist, the untrustworthy one, the criminal. The Arab is usually portrayed as that. And so what has to happen, therefore, is that you have to unpeel layers and layers and layers of stereotyping before you can even see the Arab
as a human being in that frame. And that's my affair, because on the one hand, of course, you have this kind of iconographic contrast between those young Palestinians who might not know that much, and here we have the two civilized ones in the room. And there is, of course, a narrative to be told here about the processes of dehumanization that go into building that false narrative. I recommend you read my book on this topic called Navigating War, Dissent and Empathy in Arab-US Relations, Seeing Our Others in Dark Spaces. I have a chapter on Palestine called Landscaping Otherness and Challenging Frames of Nothingness in Contemporary Palestine. It's crucial for us to know what this issue actually is all about, because there's so much talk and so much debate. Let's think about what this issue is not about. This is not an issue of Jew versus Muslim. It can't be, because the Jews and Muslims lived together for a very long time, together under Islamic rule for centuries. Remember, of course, that it's interesting, in fact, that one of the sites of the theft of homes, of occupation of territory, was in Sheikh Jarrah, and violence broke out in Sheikh Jarrah in our recent memory. Sheikh Jarrah, in fact, is named after Hussam ad-Din Jarrah. He was one of the physicians of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. The other famous physician, in fact, was Maimonides, the second Moses, they call, in fact, in Egypt. That was Salah ad-Din's physician. So how could it be then that the most famous Jewish person after Moses was Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi's physician? It's not something that is remarkably unique, because Muslims and Jews lived like that for a very long time. In fact, the golden age of Judaism was kind of in the Islamic rule. Remember, of course, the places like of importance of Qurtuba, of Islamic Spain. In fact, when the Muslims arrived in Islamic Spain in 711, and they defeated the Visigoths were making life hell for the Jews, hell for them. You had the Fourth Council of Toledo before, and Jews were forced to become baptized, forced conversions to Christianity. Their kids were separated from them, because it says that their kids can't become further entangled in their parents' deviation. Terrible atrocities. When Muslims arrived into Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, they gave the Jews rights to live as equal citizens. So much so that the Caliph Abdurrahman III, the most illustrious, I think, ruler of Islamic Spain, his diplomat was Hastai ibn Shabrut, who was Jewish. And in fact, it was so trusted. In fact, he was sent to other parts of the world to call people in to come and see the splendor of Islamic Spain. So it can't be a Muslim and Jew issue. And there's so much more to say, in fact, because the Jews, remember that when the Byzantines expelled the Jews, and Emperor Heraclius, broke off that promise of protection for the Jews, and they were into exile. Thousands had to flee, hundreds were killed, and only when the Muslims conquered the Byzantines in Palestine did the Jews come back then into Palestine. And you've had this kind of typical narrative, and it's even so much so that even today, or in our contemporary history, the Holocaust, for example, Muslims saved the lives of countless Jews. Look at Albania and the Bisa Code. Look at the Imam of the mosque in France who hid these Jewish children in the basement of the mosque. Look at North Africa. Amazing stories of this. A very good book called Among the Righteous by Robert Satloff, showing the example of Arabs who saved the lives of so many Jews. But it's not something that is unique, because that's something that we've never had a problem with. Muslims and Jews have lived together for a very long time, in that peace. We can't even say this is an Israel-Palestine issue either. I think this is an incorrect framing, because then that gives the impression that Israel has always existed. It gives the impression that Palestinians have always been kind of at loggerheads, at war and conflict with an entity called Israel forever. And that's incorrect as a framing, because remember that the Israelites first entered into Palestine around 1400 years ago. That's about 1,400 years ago, BCE, that is. Sorry, BCE, not what? Yeah, BCE. And they lived, under a kind of a unified, united empire or kingdom under prophets of Allah. that we all recognize, David and his son Sulaiman alayhi salam. When Sulaiman died, that state, they become fragmented, different sons and different parts of the kingdom, and they became fragmented. The Assyrians then, these are not Arabs, but non-Arabs, Assyrians, then invade and take over Palestine, and then they became the rulers. The Babylonians then, 612, they take over and defeat the Assyrians. And 597, of course, was Nebuchadnezzar, their king, who destroys the temple. The first destruction of the temple was by Nebuchadnezzar, 597. And then you had the second destruction by the Romans in 70 AD. And it's just been like that. So you've had, of course, Jewish revolts, first destruction, second destruction of the temple. And the Jewish people, in fact, spend more of their time out of that land in exile than they do spend, in fact, in that land. But interestingly enough, that when the Muslims take Palestine, the Jews came back into Palestine. That's something, of course, that Netanyahu didn't mention, because as not to, disturb the sensitivities of his guest there, Peterson, by mentioning when Netanyahu says, and then another people came and kicked out the Jews. He was speaking about the Crusaders, in fact, the Crusaders arrived. And by the way, so when the Crusaders first came from France, from Western Europe, you might remember that in the first crusade, they committed a massacre against the Jews in the Rhineland. And they were arguing and saying, why are we bothering with the Muslims who are far? Why don't we deal with a closer enemy to home, the Jews? And it's been a story like that for centuries. The Christians commit these pogroms and attacks against the Jews, and it's an ongoing thing. And remember, of course, that they're seeking safety oftentimes with the Muslims. Not in that example in the Crusades, but other examples like in the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, when the Muslims and Jews are both expelled from Spain, and the Jews find a safe haven and safety with the Muslims of the Maghreb. A safety. I was in Bosnia just last year, and there is a Jewish cemetery, Hebrew cemetery in Sarajevo, and it has tombstones with a Spanish dialect in them. And how would you get that? How would you get that? Because when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they found a safety with the Ottomans, Muslims in Sarajevo, and there's many examples, in fact, like that. Of safety, of seeking shelter and home, with the Muslims. Interesting. And the Christians, of course, are the ones who are always the aggressors and the ones who are perpetrating atrocities and evil against the Jews. Anyway, so we can't. I think it's incorrect to frame this as an Israel-Palestine issue, because it gives this false assumption that Israel has always existed. It has always existed. It's a new phenomenon. But that's the history of the Israelites in the land of Palestine. And then, of course, you have... So I think the correct way to frame this is an issue of settler colonialism. That's the issue. It's an issue of settler colonialism. All right, so therefore we don't frame this as a Muslim-Jew issue, nor as a Palestine-Israel issue, but in fact it's an issue of settler colonialism. What had happened is that from 1882 to 1948, Jewish immigration began from 1882 onwards. A more kind of pronounced sense of immigration, immigrating to the land of Palestine. The Ottomans, of course, were in control, and they in fact welcomed those early Jews as migrants, as refugees in their land, because again they're facing persecution, particularly from Christians and others back home in Europe. These were Ashkenazi Jews. These were Jews who came from European countries like Germany, for example, Russian Jews. They came along and they were, settled in the land. They also bought part of the land as well. You had kind of a purchasing of land that was all kind of supervised by the Ottomans. But the affairs of the world changed, in fact. The First World War happened, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Then Palestine was mandated by the British, and the British therefore encouraged more of these Jewish immigrations into Palestine. It's interesting, in fact, because if you ask the Palestinians about those immigrations, they would say that we don't have much of a problem. In fact, with those early immigrants, because we welcomed them. We already welcomed them as refugees in our homeland, and it is part of our Islamic culture that we would give courtesy and care for those who are suffering, and to be welcomed in our homeland. That's something we've already discussed before in terms of how the Muslims welcomed the Jews who suffered persecution before from Christians primarily, always kind of catered for and assisted in settling in the lands of the Muslims. But when things changed is, so you had the Shaw Commission of 1930, and it stated that, the land is not, of course, large enough to accommodate everybody, and there has to be, and if you would have more of the Jewish immigrants coming as refugees, then the native population will be displaced, meaning the Palestinians will be displaced, and so therefore there was a Zionist agenda. A Zionist agenda, therefore, was to maximize the Jews and to lessen the Arabs. That was kind of the main Zionist agenda. And where this really took head is in 1947. And that was really the beginning of the Nakba, the beginning of the catastrophe, for the Palestinian people, because it meant that the Jews, who now, of course, had turned themselves into kind of Zionist gangs, you understand, the Haganah, the Irgun gangs, and they would use brute force, violence, guns and weapons to terrorize the Palestinians out of their lands. So settler colonialism is a theft of land. It is a stealing of somebody else's land. You weren't there before. You came as a refugee, as an immigrant, and you're taking someone else's land and forcing those people, native people, off of their land. That's exactly what happened. For those who already knew that people had been living here before, Palestinians, then to make the claim that, but the new ones, the newcomers, are more advanced, are more technical in cultivation. Now, if you notice, the exact same thing that this trash-talking terrorist Netanyahu was saying in his podcast, right? That we've done more with the land, and it's so pathetic that Peterson, who was sitting there, is agreeing with that and kind of bolstering the argument of what he's saying, that because they've done more with the land, not realizing that the wealth has been built on the wealth of the Palestinian refugees who had to flee because of fear of their life, and then they left, of course, their homes and their estates and their businesses behind. That's the foundation of it. Number two, think about this. Remember that what this whole thing means, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, is that the Zionists, they defaced the whole geography of that landscape by ensuring that things became Hebraized. It means that the Arabic element was removed and the Hebrew element was in place. That the names of roads, of villages, of towns were all changed. It's so pathetic that Netanyahu said in his podcast that the Arabs left nothing, only one village, Ramla, which whatever, that's all that they had. I mean, this is so bizarre that the Zionists, when they came, they destroyed more than 500 villages. More than 500 villages, they destroyed, 521 they destroyed. 21 urban towns that they destroyed. Tiberias, in fact, itself, 21 villages in Tiberias that they destroyed. And they changed the names. In the words of Moshe Dayan, was a commander fighting under David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister in the 1948 war. He was a commander. What did he write? He said that there is not a single place where Jews have settled except Arabs used to live there before. He said, we don't know the names of those places anymore because the geography books have been destroyed. But we know that, Nahal was once Malahal, or, he's given the names, kibbutz, he's given the names of these, I'll put them up on the screen, names of locations that the names have been changed. But we know there's so many others. Look, for example, Tiberias, Sephoria becomes Zippori, Basama becomes Byzanki. I mean, all these names have been changed to hide the fact that before this time, the Arabs, Palestinians used to live there. These were their villages. And so the extent of the lies has just been absolutely deplorable. It's one thing, of course, being in front of a war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu. But what makes it so much worse is that you put yourself in the middle of all of these lies. And like I said, it's not something that is, difficult to find evidence against all of the nonsense that was spoken by Netanyahu. These are things that are published again and again and again. Ilan Pape's book, Ethnic Cleansing, this book, Disappearing Palestine, by Jonathan Cook, and there's so many others out there, Even, for example, Haaretz, the Israeli paper, spoke about the Manshia, or the district. These are like neighborhoods completely erased from memory by the Israelis from 1948, until there isn't a sight of them and a mention of them anymore, because they've all been Hebraized. I mean, they've all been turned into Hebrew names as opposed to Arab names. For example, the authors write about the Manshia district, that in 1948 there were 12,000 residents in 1948, and this is one neighborhood. I mean, talk about the claim about there was no one here, a land without a people for people without a land. 12,000 people in one neighborhood, 20 coffee houses, 14 carpentry workshops, 12 bakeries, 10 laundries, 4 schools, 3 bicycle stores, 3 pharmacies, and 2 mosques. In one neighborhood, Manshi neighborhood. This is from Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. And this is a one tiny small example. I recommend you to read this book called Kirbet Kizeh by S. Yizhar. This is by an Israeli author. He writes as a historic fiction about the Nakba 1948, the catastrophe, the violent expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. S. Yizhar writes this book. It's a pen name because he was scared about the reaction if he put his real name there. But read the book. It's historic fiction. It's not even, it's a fiction, but it's detailing what it was like for these new migrants violently expelling Palestinians from their homes. And I'll just read for you a short excerpt from this book. He said, the people who would live in this village, wouldn't the walls cry out in their ears? Those sighs, screams that were screamed and that were not screamed, the confused innocence of dazed sheep, the submissiveness of the weak, and the heroism, that unique heroism of the weak, who didn't know what to do and were unable to do anything. The silenced weak, would the new settlers not sense that the air here was heavy with shades, voices, and stares? He says, I felt a sudden, terrifying collapse inside me. I had a single set idea like a hammered nail that I could never be reconciled to anything, so long as the tears of a weeping child still glistened as he walked along with his mother, who furiously fought back her soundless tears on his way into exile, bearing with him a roar of injustice and such a scream that it was impossible that no one in the world would gather that scream in when the moment came. And then I said to Moshe, we have no right, Moshe, to kick them out of here. I didn't want my voice to tremble. I mean, there's so many stories here. There's so many narratives here of the violent expulsion of Palestinians, so many injustices. You should know better, Dr. Peterson. Now, what about Rachel Corrie from her book, Let Me Stand Alone, American youth, young activist, who gave her life defending the homes of Palestinian farmers. She was bulldozed to death by Israelis. But she writes in her book, in her diary entries that were collected later by her parents, she says in her book that, what is there beautiful? We could go, the people here live within smell of the ocean, but they can't go see it anymore. What is there beautiful? We could go see the ocean, one thing beautiful. Now I cannot see the ocean. What is for the children that is beautiful? An 8-year-old named Ali died the other day before I came. He just wanted to look at the tank, see the tank, and explode his head. And there's so many things like this, about the victimization, the oppression of Palestinians, you know, it's not a new thing. So I'm saying it's not a new thing. It's something you should have known more about. If you've removed the people and you've ethnically cleansed that landscape, and you've settled colonialism, you've brought in your people and made new settlements and new homes and new villages. In fact, they built malls and car parks and planted forests over villages where Palestinians lived. It's a very good book called Ethnic Cleansing by Ilan Pappé. Perhaps Peterson should have read that book. Ethnic Cleansing by Ilan Pappé is a very famous book, and he, of course, himself is an Israeli Jew. And there's so many others like that as well. You know, so I think that this is something for all of us to think about. The fact that this is not a Jew-Muslim issue, this is not Israel-Palestine issue, this is an issue of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Benjamin Netanyahu was brazen enough to mention Mark Twain. And I was really quite shocked. Why would you mention Mark Twain? Mark Twain, of course, the American humorist, satirist, who authors famously The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that we were, of course, familiar with, was mentioned by Netanyahu to support the claim, his false claim, that Palestine was a barren, so-called barren land. Now, of course, this is a very old Zionist kind of myth. And there's many articles and books that we're going to go through, inshallah, in what proceeds from this presentation. But about Mark Twain, of course, visits Palestine, and he goes and visits some biblical sites. Very short trip, and only a few sites he visits. He does praise, in fact, some places like Nablus and Jaffa. But Mark Twain wrote very negatively, in fact, against Jews. And some would even say that he was kind of an anti-Semite in that respect, because he spoke very against the Jewish people. But that's not my point, in fact, in this. There's something else I think we might have missed in the podcast. So one is that Netanyahu mentions Mark Twain, and he says that Mark Twain has a bad experience, and therefore he writes negatively about his experience in Palestine. But at another point, you might remember that Netanyahu says that this Israel, that is not the Congo, and we are not Belgium. We're not Belgium, and this isn't the Congo. And really, my ears just pricked up when he said those words, because I thought, wow, what a deceptive fraudster. What a fraudster. But it also shocked me that Peterson perhaps didn't know about this, that he couldn't catch on to this, and he was kind of didn't understand what's happening here. Because remember that Mark Twain also wrote another very, very important text called King Leopold's Soliloquy, this over here. And he wrote this as a response to what's happening in the Congo, because Congo, of course, they're extracting ivory and rubber from the forests of Congo. And if you couldn't work hard enough, fast enough in the Congo, then King Leopold would have the workers, the Congolese people, it would have their hands amputated because of that. And so Edmond de Morel, who was like this French-British diplomat, goes to the Congo and sees what's happening there. He comes back, he petitions Mark Twain to write something against this. He refused. And then he changes his mind in 1904 and begins to pen this text, King Leopold's Soliloquy. And it's a damning indictment against the injustice of King Leopold and what's happening in that Belgian colony in the Congo. And I thought the fact that he mentioned this is not Belgium and we're not the Belgium, this is not Congo. And also he mentioned Mark Twain as well. I thought it's a point that we might have missed, because Mark Twain, I think if Mark Twain was alive, if he had lived, he died in 1910, if he had lived to see what's happening, what would happen to the Palestinians in the Nakba 1948 and the injustice, he would have written another soliloquy. If he was alive today, he would have written another soliloquy about Netanyahu himself, because he became a voice of moral, not just compassion, moral consistency. And that's something that is profound in the writings of Mark Twain, in fact, as well.
And so this is a message directly to you, Dr. J.B. Peterson. Perhaps you realize by now, at least, that the reaction you've provoked from the Muslim community and others following your podcast with Benjamin Netanyahu has been one of great dismay, of anger, of disbelief, shock, at how somebody like yourself, who had been, of course, once perhaps celebrated, applauded in many parts of the community for your stance and your stand on issues of social justice and some cases of morality, had now seemingly turned sides. Your new associations, your new companions in life, the Daily Wire, the podcast, your failure to interrogate Netanyahu on some such basic points, the rewriting, fabrication of history by Netanyahu, and you, of course, perhaps, I don't think you can claim ignorance, because these are such basic points, such obvious lies, deceit, deceptions that were espoused by Netanyahu in your presence. You should have at least questioned him further, at least interrogated him and asked him for more. But it seems you were kind of complicit in this. And my advice to you in all of this, in fact, is this: that remember, number one, that God will judge all of us, that there will come a time we will all stand in that divine setting, and all of us will face divine accountability. Your knowledge, your experience, your standing in society will be a proof for you or a proof against you on that day. Number two, realize that history also will record all of us, will judge us, in fact. I was in Munich just some months back. I traveled to Munich University, and I went to the atrium where Sophia Scholl stood with Hans Scholl, and I was there, and I kind of imagined the scene when she threw that wad of leaflets down, and they all scattered on the floor, and that's February 18, 1943, and they were caught, of course, and then sentenced to death on February 22nd, 1943 by the Nazis. And I went there just to kind of see if I could somehow, in some way, encapsulate the moment of history in the setting of that space. Now in Germany, in fact, the road leading to the university is called the Sophia Scholl Plaza. It's a road named after her today. There are more than 200 schools in Germany named after Sophia Scholl. Her old school called Ulm Gymnasium is now called Hans and Sophia Scholl Gymnasium. The highest award and prize offered in Germany is a Sophie Award. History might say something at one point, as it did for these two brothers and sisters, and of course the White Rose Movement, as it did for them in that time when the Nazis were in power. But it says something different about them today. History records people differently later, afterwards. The choices you make in life today, the alliances you kind of take on board for yourself, the job that you have, the things that you speak and don't speak, all of these will make a difference. If they don't make that much difference today, they will make a lot of difference, in fact, tomorrow. You have that choice to make. You have to choose to be on that right side of history. Point number three is for you to take a leaf out of your own book. One of your first, in fact, the first principle I think you have in your laws of power and change is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. To stand up straight with your shoulders back, you know how I interpret it, means to have a degree of courage and resistance in yourself, in your personality. And I think that this is, of course, a time where that's needed. You have made a great error, a great mistake. But I would say that, even though we make mistakes in life, there is always a chance for us to correct those mistakes. Your apology, your disassociation with war criminals makes a difference to you as a person in terms of your consciousness, and also to the world that is observing and watching you. That is something I think we have to bear in mind. And I want therefore for you to take these things on board. Remember, of course, that life is short for all of us, that God will judge us all of us. History will record us and judge us, all of us. Remember the bravery of people like Hans Scholl and Christopher Brooks and Willie Graf and Sophia Scholl and others of the White Rose Movement. And remember how they figured today, even though yesterday they were deemed to be traitors and so on and so forth. We have to make that choice in light of your own principle of standing up straight with your shoulders back. I hope these words can mean something for you and remind you, of course, that the legacy of Palestine is one that is engraved in the collective memory of the international world. The World Cup, in fact, was a reminder, wasn't it so? A reminder that, you know, you had Palestinian flags draped around people all over. What amazing, shocking scenes. What about Morocco? Remember, of course, that what you might think there's progress in all of this Abraham Accords and normalization. It means absolutely nothing. It's trash. Trash. It's trash, of course, to try and think you can normalize with people or nations, I would say, governments, at the expense of the suffering of a people. The elephant in the room is the suffering of the Palestinian people. The elephant in the room is the settlement program that is unending. The elephant in the room is the occupation of Palestine. That is the elephant in the room. And so, at least if we take the symbolic entry of the World Cup here, and you could see that even the Moroccan players and the Moroccan team were celebrating Palestine, doesn't mean that normalizing with a country is normalizing with the people. It means the opposite, in fact. You have not normalized with the people. They have not normalized with Israel, even though the country is doing something else. It's a point in case. And so therefore the Muslims and others who are conscientious, the objectors, the people of many of the refuseniks who have refused to serve in the IDF, the conscientious people of our world who refuse to bow down to pressure, refuse the false narrative, the lies of the Zionists. The brave people of our world will all side with those who are victimized and oppressed in our world, whether they're in occupied Palestine or anywhere else. That is the right thing for any right person to do. That is what it means to stand up straight with your shoulders back. And I think that this is a reminder that one day, of course, Palestine will be free. That one day Palestine will be liberated. Injustice can't remain forever. And what's going to happen is that when that history is told and narratives are unearthed, and remember, of course, that the story is told by millions and millions of people, what's going to happen to those voices of betrayal, voices of deception, voices of deceit, voices of falsifying of history? They're going to be in the garbage bin of history, meaningless now. The ones, and you would know, of course, as a clinical psychologist, that whenever you have situations of oppression, genocide, mass killing, injustice, you have four kinds of people that emerge. You have the perpetrators, in this case, the Zionists. You have the victims, in this case, the Palestinians. And you have the bystanders. Those who are really worse, I think, than the other two, because they simply watch it all happen and they clap it all along and they laugh it all through and they do nothing, and they do nothing to assist and help where they could have and they should have done something to aid and assist. And number four, you have the rescuers. You have those brave souls, those brave people who fight back, who use their courage, use their strength, whatever they have at their disposal, the words, who use their courage, who use their sentiments, who use something to push back against the injustice. Those are the ones that we aim and hope to be of. Hope to be of the rescuers. Those are the ones that are the good people, the good lot. We ask Allah to make us of those people, the rescuers. And I think you have a choice, like we all have a choice in life. And I would hope that you would make the right choice, for your own benefit, for your own sake, and for the sake of your salvation in this life and in the next life also. And lastly, I would invite you to look more into Islam. Perhaps what you've read hasn't been sufficient. What you've read maybe has come from the other side of the fence who seek to malign, but be a person of that same principle of courage by learning more and reading more about the great faith of Islam. There's so much, of course, that we've spoken about already in terms of the way that the Muslim history has been a source of great hope-bearing for the Jews in their own moments of tragedy and moments of turmoil, as they were dispossessed from several places during pogroms committed by the Christians, and they would find a safety and safe haven with the Muslims in many parts of the world. Maybe you should read more about that history and more about the contributions of Islamic civilization to the world, in fact, as large. And so I would invite you, therefore, to read the Quran, to learn about the beautiful life and character of the Prophet Muhammad, peace of Allah be upon him and upon all of the prophets of Allah. And I will leave it there.